Your info captain for 2025-2026. Unfortunately, I am not Mr. Lingerman, but today I'll basically be going over the info outline addendum, where I'll basically be adding on to the outline videos from Mr. Lingerman and kind of just updating them on how to build the structures according to the 5 different archetypes that of speeches that you've seen. So first, we'll talk about the basics. So remember that info is all about myth busting. I think this is the most important concept that you should remember about the speech event. No matter if it's in your intro, your body paragraphs, or your conclusion, you should always be trying to change how your judge and your audience sees your topic or sees the world. Because that's how you really inform people, by changing their view or assumption about something. Now, the structure of an info is pretty similar to a 5 body paragraph essay, where you start with an intro, 3 body paragraphs, and conclusion. Now, these body paragraphs will usually call them aspects because it's a little looser than, say, an event like oratory where they have 2 prongs and a DI. But the structure is generally pretty similar. So with that, let's get into our 5 archetypes. The first one is the identity explainer, which is all about what makes you unique and why should your audience care about your unique identity. So what you'll notice with a lot of these identity explainers is that they have a lot of personal connection. And it makes sense because the speech is all about what makes the speaker unique. So the speech we'll be using as an example is Gavin Griffin's 2023 speech, Hot Dog Fried Rice, in which he talks about his struggles of being a biracial American. So the first thing that you'll notice about an identity explainer is that it has a very strong personal connection, usually in the intro. For example, in Gavin's speech, his hook is about how his mom made hot dog fried rice, which is a mix of Chinese and Western cuisine. And as a result, it made him reflect on his identity as being both Chinese and white, but also being neither at the same time. Now, what you'll notice is that for most of these speeches, you want to establish that personal connection in the beginning because that gives you a lot of credibility surrounding the topic. Now, for the body paragraph structure, it's pretty simple, in which he first starts with history, talking about something known as the one drop rule, which was a law in the 19th century where multiracial Americans were forced to be part of their minority half. And then he moves into his modern examples, talking about how the one drop rule and this idea that biracial and multiracial Americans can only fit into one side of their identity is still prevalent in today's mindset, with like examples from Obama. And finally, he moves on to the implications or impacts of his speech, kind of talking about the mental health crises biracial Americans face because they can't identify with both sides of their identity. So, what we notice about all 3 of these aspects is that they both point to an implicit thesis about why it's important to have nuance and understand that biracial Americans are both are equally one side and the other. And it kind of attacks this American assumption or busts the myth that biracial Americans only belong to one half of their identity. And often these identity explainers not only is their personal connection in the intro, but their conclusions are generally more reflective and personal too. So with Gavin's speech, he kind of ends his speech talking about how he feels as a biracial American, and kind of while he touches on and like recaps on his 3 aspects, he also uses his personal example as like real life anecdotes of them happening. Like he talks about his struggles with mental health, or how he felt with the one drop rule with his personal experiences. The next archetype is known as the Mythbuster, which is what a traditional info looks like, which is what's a commonly held belief that isn't true and how is it more impactful than we think. I think the key part about this is really about the impact of these myths, because it's very easy to myth bust and just be like, oh, we think X but actually Y, but making your audience care and showing how this myth affects us in ways that we don't know is what makes these speeches really successful. So the speech we'll be analyzing for this archetype is Emerson Forster's 2025 speech, Seeing is Believing, in which she kind of talks about how important of a role vision is and how we might not realize how important vision is. And as a result, how large media or corporations can manipulate vision for their own benefit. So usually these intros are less personal because it isn't as a personal speech, but they often try to show just how prevalent the whatever myth they're trying to convey. So, for example, in Emerson's speech, she starts with her speech giving it backwards with her back facing the audience, just to show how important it is to see the speaker in a speech rather than just listen to the words or the content or the delivery of the speech. Now, for her body paragraphs, it's similar to the identity explainer, in which she starts. The only difference is that she first starts with myth busting, or really giving just general info about human vision and how big of a role it plays in our lives. Talking about how like people couldn't judge a music competition unless they saw people actually playing the instrument. And then she moves on to modern relevance and implications, which is pretty similar to the identity explainer, in which she talks about how digital media in the modern age has satirized or saturated our vision, and as a result, modern media has manipulated our vision to be able to spread misinformation much quickly. Now, one thing that I see a lot of infos fall into when they try to do the Mythbuster archetype is that they think it's just listing random, cool, interesting, fun facts about your topic. But yes, myth busting is about giving cool and fun facts about your topic, but it's also really important that these fun facts connect to your greater thesis. So for Emerson, her greater thesis is about how vision is super important in our lives and how easy it is to to manipulate our vision by large companies and mass media. And each of her examples, even though they seem random, such as that example about a music competition, they both point towards this implicit thesis about how plays a bigger role in our lives than you think. The next archetype is the forgotten need. And in my opinion, this is a mixture of myth busting and the next archetype, which is social commentary, in which the key question that you're answering with this kind of speech is what have we forgotten or lost in the modern world? And so for these speeches, the structure is generally a bit looser because you have a lot to play around with. So the example we'll be analyzing is Eleanor Culleton's 2024 speech, Oh What Fun, which basically the topic is play, and she kind of talks about how as a society, we stigmatize playing as something that's childish, but as a result, it's negatively affecting our society. So her intro is talking about the game show Survivor, and she first starts kind of making fun of the adults like playing around and being like, oh, they're so childish. But then she talks about how, as a society, that's an assumption that we have. Remember, she's busting the myth that play is immature and unimportant. Now, her body paragraph structure is a little looser. So, first, she starts with why playing is needed in the modern world, or she kind of talks about how in the past play was needed. So she kind of goes into the psychology of play and why it has a lot of health benefits. But then she moves into her second paragraph, which is how do we lose play in the modern world? In which she brings up two examples. One about how gender disparities have caused women to play less than men, and also as a result, there's these things known as play deserts or areas with a lack of play equipment or playgrounds across the US, and how that's inhibiting children from playing around in 2024. And finally are her implications or impacts of this speech, where she talks about how the lack of play has resulted in a mental health crisis and how it's negatively affecting even our education. And she finally ends the speech with a pretty standard conclusion going through all of her three main points. I think the key takeaway for the forgotten need speech is that really need to explain three things. The first thing is what do we forget or what have we lost in the modern world and why is that thing important? The second is you need to explain how do we lose it, and oftentimes it's like from social stigma or say industrialization or commodification. And then finally you need to say why does that matter? So in general it's similar to the other speeches, but the structure can be a little looser. The fourth archetype is what I mentioned earlier, which is social commentary. And these speeches are more often than not semi political. And it's less, what I'll say about these speeches is that they're a little less argumentative than the other speeches. So the key question you want to answer is what is a relevant controversy in today's world? And as a result, these speeches generally pair well with the identity explainer, especially in today where politics is saturated with a lot of identity politics. So it's really easy for speakers to have a personal connection to get access to them. but it's not necessary for you to have a personal connection to write a social commentary speech. You just need to think about what are the important issues, what are the hot button issues in today's world that are being debated all over again. So, the speaker that I will analyze is Emmett Carlson's 2025 speech, An Outing with Elphaba, which is a speech about outing, which is the act of coming out. And he kind of talks about both how outing is good in the sense that it can help, it's a sign that LGBTQ people are reclaiming their identity, but he also talks about how outing can be weaponized by politicians and legislations in today's era. So his body paragraph structure or aspect structure usually skews a little more history just because we really want to understand all the complexities surrounding this topic. So he first talks about the history of how outing was used as a political force, but also as a force in which LGBT people celebrated their identity. And then he kind of talks about the modern impacts of outing, in which he talks about, say, the Don't Say Gay bills or laws in California that support outing. And finally, it's less of an aspect, but he does kind of imply to this in the conclusion, which is that he talks about how there's a lot of nuance surrounding this debate about outing and how outing isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's both good and bad depending on the context. I think what's really important about social commentary speeches is that you should try to strive for that complexity point, where you don't want to just argue for one side and not look at the other. Because with these speeches, they're so complicated that if you argue for one side and not the other, you'll most likely offend a judge in some way, shape, or form. So, with these speeches, what you really want to do is highlight how both sides of the debate are valid in some way, but prove that this topic is really important and impactful than what you might think, and really discussing both sides of the debate. You don't necessarily have to agree with both sides, like, obviously, you can strongly suggest that one side is more justified than the other, but it's important to note that you want to acknowledge the other side with this kind of archetype. And with all of these combined, I think in general there are some key points that you want to have in your speech. The first is that your intro should be a metaphor for a thesis. Notice that in all five of these archetypes, whether it be Gavin's speech that starts with hot dog fried rice, or say Eleanor's speech talking about the show Survivor, they both kind of hint at their implied thesis. So for Gavin, hot dog fried rice hints at this idea of being both and neither at the same time. Eleanor's speech hints at the fact that we treat play as childish and we stigmatize it. But both your AGDs or your hooks should really be hinting at your thesis, and you should be referencing your intro throughout your speech just to show how prevalent of an issue your topic is. The second point to remember is that each body paragraph sets up a point in your implicit thesis, and that none of your body paragraphs should be purely descriptive. They should always be myth busting. I think that's the biggest takeaway of info is that you always want to change how your audience sees your topic. Even if it's the first aspect where you're just laying out the groundwork and context, like history or psychology of your topic, you still want to show how like common perceptions about your topic are wrong. And finally, what I want you to take away is that this addendum video is not a formula that you should follow. You should not follow this video word for word. All five of these archetypes are just ways to get you started in thinking about how to write your speech, but they are by no means a rigid structure that you have to follow. Most infos often cover 1 to 2 archetypes, and a lot of them aren't even part of the archetypes, and they still work successfully in their own way. I think the general rule that I can give is, again, you need to change what your audience thinks about your topic. And you do that by telling a story. You do that by first setting context about your topic, and then you kind of end up showing the impacts of either the assumption or the impacts of knowing the true extent of your topic. So I think with all of these, I'm very excited to see your speeches and get the boat rowing. See ya.